Seconds. All right, everyone say, oh, wow, good. Wow. Good morning, everyone. I'll say, what a beautiful and incredible way to start off the week. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. First of all, to thank our special Mizonos sponsor today, Rabbi Milt Gertner, for dedicating all of the Mizonos this morning. Beautiful, again. Let's make Mizonos great again. Bring it back, Baruch Hashem. It's beautiful. Again, nothing starts out the week like a little bit of Torah. It's Ruchnius and Gashmius all rolled into one. So again, Rabbi Milt, thank you so very much. Yesher koach. I would like to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, to thank Yankee and Elisa Statman, Yitzki and Rebecca Statman, for dedicating the Sherman Drushos this month, the commemoration of the first yahrzeit of their sister, Menucha Shendel Yehudit Zichron Lebracha Bas David Yosef. To thank Shmuel Rabin Karabkin for dedicating the Shurim this month, in commemoration of the 25th yahrzeit of Rabin's mother, Pesa Mira Bas Chaim. And to thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Zevi and Shoshi Daniel Le'ili Nishmas, Rafael Yaakov Ben Avraham Zichron Lebracha, and to thank Jeff and Debbie Schwartz for dedicating the Week of Learning commemoration of the 5th yahrzeit of Debbie's mother, Shulamis Bas Shmuel. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamos will have an aliyah and the families in nechama. And also with that, let us begin. We have a really very interesting daf ahead of us today, some really fascinating yisodos as well. So with that, let us begin. I will say today's daf is Yud Beis 12. We are picking up on Yud Aleph Amud Beis 11b at the 2 dots. So approximately 7 lines up from the bottom. So remember again, quoting the Mishnah, Tahar v'tamei no sero pigol of aser. So let's remember again, we are continuing now in the conversation regarding kinuyin, about the use of equivalent terms, or for that matter, again, also some yados, partial terms. The ikar part of this Mishnah is the concept, as I mentioned in yesterday's shir, about hatfasa. Hatfasa means you take something permitted and literally, again, you attach it to something prohibited, thereby conveying the prohibited status to the permitted item. Good, and that's what we spent. We spent yesterday speaking a lot about liz and laz and different things like this. Lachulin, lichulin. Good. Let's go back there. Says the Gemara. So tar, tame, nosar, pigol, aser. So remember again the examples that the Mishnah gave is a person says, for example, lo tahar sha'ocha lefanecha. Right? Lo tahar. That was the lashon of the Mishnah just said tahar. But again, we understand that to mean lo tahar sha'ocha lefanecha. It's not tahar, that which I'm going to consume of yours. Or tamei sha'ocha lefanecha. That which I would eat of yours is tamei. Or no sar or pigol. All of that creates a state of prohibition. Good, says the Gemara. Bayram Abraham will say this is an incredible shayla. Hare alai kibasar zivche shlamim la'achar zvikas damim mahu. Watch this. Let's say a person says, imagine I have a piece of meat in front of me. We'll assume this is the case for just a moment. I have a piece of meat in front of me, and I say this piece of meat should be to me like the meat of shlamim after zrika. Then I will say, what's the halacha? Remember again, shlamim, the nature of shlamim is a carbon. It's called shlamim because it creates shalom. It creates shalom. Why? Because everyone has a portion. Part of it goes up on the mizbeach, part of it given to the kohanim, part of it given to the owners of the carbon. The halacha is that after the zrika, the meat becomes permitted for consumption. So an interesting case here. What happens if halacha l'maisa, I go ahead, I have a piece of meat in front of me, and I say, this piece of meat should be like the meat of shlamim after zrika. What's the halacha? To which the Gemara says, Se'idi kamar b'hadin lishna beter kamatvis. That's not a shayla. Why, Rabbi say? Because if you make a statement like that, then you are linking the meat in front of you to what? To a permitted item. In other words, Rabbi say the meat of shlamim after zrika is mutter. So if you say this piece of meat should be like meat of shlamim after zrika, it's not a shayla. In other words, you haven't really said anything. In other words, the meat is permitted. Rather, what's the case? Ella, here we go. This is so interesting. Kigon demachis basar zivche shlamim, umachis dehetera gabe, va'amar zeh kazeh. Here we go, Bosai. Imagine the following scenario. You have a piece of shlamim meat, and it happens to use after zrika. and you have it sitting on the table, and right next to it you have an ordinary piece of meat. So you go ahead and you say, ultimately again, zu kazeh, or zeh kazeh. This piece of meat, meaning the ordinary piece of meat, should be like this piece of meat, the shlomim meat. So watch this. What's the shaila? So mai, bi'ikaro kamatvis, or behetera kamatvis. Rabbi said, listen to how fascinating this is. When you're connecting, we'll call the chulin piece of meat to the shlomim piece of meat. So what state of shlomim are you connecting the permitted piece of meat to? Are you connecting it? Are you matfisit bi'ikaro? Rabbi said bi'ikaro means the original essence of the meat. The original essence of the meat refers to the state of the meat before zrika. At the moment that it became a shlomim meat. So do we say you're linking the permitted piece of meat to the original state of shlomim, in which case again, you're now generating an isser upon the ordinary piece of meat? Or do we say that halacha l'maisa kamatvis behetera? Or perhaps you're going ahead and linking it at what? To what? To the present state of the shlomim meat. What's the present state of the shlomim meat? Mutter, because it's after zrika. I'll say, what a good kasha. What a good kasha. In other words, when you're linking, and again, so remember, to be clear, if I explicitly link we'll call it chulin piece of meat, my regular piece of meat, to basar shlomim achar zrika, everyone agrees what's the impact of that statement? It's mutter. In other words, nothing really to talk about. You haven't done anything because shlomim meat after zrika is mutter. The shaila is, I have shlomim meat on the table, ordinary piece of meat on the table, and I say zeh kazeh. The ordinary should be like the shlomim. What am I linking it to? Ikaro, the essence of the shlamim, which refers to shlamim prior to zrika, or ultimately, again, the state of the shlamim as it is now. State of shlamim as it is now. I'll just point out how interesting this is. If you take a look at the Ran for just a moment, the Ran says over here, it's last line on the page, 3 lines up from the bottom, Bi'ikaro kamatvis, bi'isuro shahaya kodem zrikas damim. So I will say, what's interesting is the Gemara understands the ikr state of shlamim is when it's kulo kadosh, when it's totally holy, not permitted for consumption. The present state is ultimately, again, where it's not permitted for consumption. It's interesting to see that in halacha, the primary state of any object is when it's in its fullest state of inherent holiness. Sometimes present circumstances do not look like the ikr state. And if it's true for a covenant, I'll say how much more true it is for man as well. Right? I will say, what's my ikr state? What's my ikr? What's my ikaro? My ikr is kedusha. The difference is that sometimes, at the end of the day, that's not what I look like. That's not what I look like. My present state does not reflect my ikr. My ikr is kedusha. My present often is often compromised by a series of bad decisions or wrong turns. It's an incredible Musar Haskell. In any event, that's our shaila. Says the Gemara, so what's the halacha? So we'll say this is Rami Bar Chama's shaila, and the truth is we're going to pretty much spend the rest of the daf trying to go ahead and answer this question. So here we go. Amar Rava, Tashma. So Rava says, let's explain. No saru pigol. So we'll say, remember again, examples that the Mishnah gave of no sar and pigol. For example, we'll say, now this was a case of where I have a piece of meat in front of me, and I say the piece of meat, right, no sar. The piece of meat is pigol. So the Mishnah understood that to mean that essentially I'm taking a neder to prohibit these particular pieces of meat. Type of Yud Beis, Vaha, no saru pigol, la'achar zrikas tamu. So we'll say, so the truth is, the Ran says really take out pigol from this. This is not really a conversation about pigol, because the truth is pigol could occur at any state of the sacrificial process. So rather, really, the Ran explains that this is really referring to nosar. The state of nosar, ultimately really only comes about when? Achar zrikas tamin. So it would appear that whenever you're linking something permitted to a sacrificial item, what state of the sacrificial item are you linking it to? The state after zrika, which in the shlamim case just means you're not really making a neder of prohibition. But this is the right the Gemara is doing. I'll say if you look at the Ran, again, Ran on the left-hand side, it's actually just a couple of lines right before the Ran, Divrei Hamaskil benosar shal ola. Couple lines in. So the Ran says, Elami nosar kaparach de iser nidara pakale bezrikas dam, vafilu hachi tnan da asar ama bi'ikaro kamatvis. So I will say this. So this is very interesting. With nosar, interestingly enough, once you go ahead and you have zrika, so technically again, the neder element of the carbon has now left, And therefore, again, all I'm really left with, ultimately, again, is the Ikar prohibition. So the Gemara is using this actually as a raya, that when you go ahead and you link something to a carbon, you are ultimately linking it to its primary original status. No, what are we talking about? We're talking about the nosar of Ola. And I will say, what's the chap with the nosar of Ola? Sin Ola never becomes permitted for consumption. So because of that, Ola always retains its prohibited status. So Ola is one of these interesting karbanos where it makes no difference before Zrika, after Zrika. I was going to say, it's not just Ola, it's a lot of karbanos like that. Well, let's go with Ola. In other words, a lot of karbanos, there is a distinction in status pre-Zrika, post-Zrika. We could be talking about over here, no sar of Ola, where there's no fundamental distinction before Zrika or after Zrika. I'll say, I want to be clear. Rami Bar Chama was asking on a very specific case of shlamim. Shlamim is a carbon where there is a distinction between pre-Zrika status, where it's aser, versus post-Zrika status, where it's mutter. Rami Bar Chama's case is, I've got two pieces of meat on the table. Shlamim after Zrika, and a regular piece of meat. I say the regular piece of meat, zeh, regular piece of meat, should be like zeh shlamim. What's my shaila? What state of shlamim am I linking my regular piece of meat to? To the pre-Zrika state, in which case it's aser, or to the post-Zrika state, in which case it's mutter. The Gemara tries to bring a raya from the case of nosar in our Mishnah, that clearly we're linking it to the pre-Zrika state, to which the Gemara says maybe not. Maybe the case of nosar in the Mishnah is a case of nosar of Ola, in which case what? There's no difference pre-Zrika or post-Zrika. So Amar Lehi says, Imkein listening bebasar Ola. If that's the case, then why don't you just leave out nosar altogether? And just go ahead and just talk about Ola meat. To which the Gemara says, Lomi bai kamar. Lomi bai basar Ola da asar da haba carbon kamatvis. Shabbos goes without saying that if you go out and you make a neder, and you say that what? Zeh kazeh, this piece of meat, ordinary piece, should be like this piece, this Ola meat. Everyone agrees that, of course, it's going to be aser. So the Gemara says, Upigol da Ola itzrichale. Here's the difference, Rabbi say. You need the case of pigol. Why? Sagadai tamina, ki iser nosar, ki iser pigol, v'havile ki matfis v'davar ha'asar v'lo mitzar. So Rabbi say, I'm going to tell you a concept now that the Gemara is going to constantly make nuanced reference to, but we're actually not going to get to it until Daf Yud Gimel, which I'm actually going to try to get to today. Suppose he's listened. Who just laughed at that? Who just laughed at when I said I'm going to try to get that? I heard that under the breath chuckle. Right? So I said, now listen to this. So we're going to see. We have not been introduced to this idea yet, but the Gemara is operating with this principle. We were introduced in yesterday's Mishnah, hatfasa. What's hatfasa? What's hatfasa? You can link something or attach something permitted to something prohibited, and the permitted item takes on the status of the prohibited item. What we are going to see is a unique concept in hatfasa, is that it only works if you link the permitted item to a prohibited item that's not inherently aser. So, all right, so in other words, the only way to link a permitted item to a prohibited item is if the prohibited item is only aser because of a neder. If it's something inherently prohibited, then it will not work. And the logic is just, again, we'll see it's really based on psukim, but which makes sense. In other words, essentially, I could go ahead and derive neder prohibition from an item that's already prohibited by a neder. But something that's inherently prohibited, the concept of hatfasa, of attaching a permitted item to the prohibited item, will not work. So we'll say, now watch this. So here's what the Gemara says. When the Mishnah says that something, right, if I go ahead and I take a permitted item and I say, this item should be like nosar, or should be like pigol. So we'll say, one second, nosar and pigol are inherent prohibitions. So the Gemara says, you're right. In fact, the case of nosar and pigol in the Mishnah are cases of nosar and pigol, ultimately, again, of basar ola. So really what we're saying is like this. Now, ola, right, a carbon ola, comes about as a result of a neder. We'll say we're going to see that even in cases where you're chayiv in ola, an animal really only becomes designated as a carbon when a person wills it that way. That's called the neder also. In other words, we often look at nedarim as voluntary things, But we're going to see even sometimes when you're obligated, for example, if I go ahead and I bring a carbon, let's say I'm obligated to bring the carbon. That's true, but the animal only becomes a carbon when I designate it. So that act of designation is in and of itself has the status almost of a quasi-carbon a quasi-neder. So therefore I was like this, the chiddush is like this. The chiddush is that when you do hatfasa to pigul and nosar, I would have thought that doesn't work. Well, it doesn't work. Why? Because you can only do hatfasa to something that is prohibited by the koach of a neder, but not by something that is inherently aser. Therefore, again, the Gemara says, kamash malan, that halacha lemaisa, when I say nosar and pigul, what I'm really referring to is what? The carbon. The carbon. So when I say this should be like nosar, this should be like pigul, really what I'm doing is I'm doing hatfasa with the carbon itself, and we're assuming that the carbon itself is prohibited by the koach of a neder, koach of a vow, therefore hatfasa works. Beautiful. So the Gemara is supposed to say, if you look at Rashi for just a moment, so Rashi in Kamashon, right where you see the rush in the margin, so go across from the rush into Rashi, about 3 lines up. Kamash Malon, Haidu Ka'amar Nosar Pigol, Lav Isser Nosar Pigol Ka'amar, Isser Kamoso, Ella, Benosar Mamish, Pigol Mamish, Tahave, Davra, another. Good. So the Gemara says as follows, Meisve, so raise a kasha to this. Ezu is Shabosai. So again, just to point out, we're still we're still trying to get through Rami Bar Chama's question. Zeh kazeh, I have a piece of ordinary meat, a piece of shlamim meat after zrika. I say the ordinary meat should be like the piece of shlamim meat. What's the halacha? Am I doing hatfasa to the current state of the shlamim meat, in which case I have not created an eder of prohibition, or to the primary state of the shlamim meat, in which case again I've created a prohibition? Mesa, let's go further. Ezu Isra, very interesting case. What's an example of the Isser Ha'amor Batorah? Now what does that mean? In other words, halacha l'maisa, what's a good example ultimately again of creating an Isser Neder? Watch this. Amar Hareini shelo ochal basar shelo eshte yaim ki yom shemeis bo aviv ki yom shemeis bo rabo ki yom shenegrag bo Gedalia ben Achikam ki yom sheraisi Yerushalayim b'chorbana. Supposed to listen to this. A person makes a neder, and what is he saying? I hereby take upon myself that I will not eat meat and not drink wine, like the day that my father passed away, or like the day that my Rebbe passed away, like the day that Gedalia ben Achikam, that's some Gedalia, was assassinated, or like the day that I saw Yerushalayim in a state of ruin. In a state of ruin. So what's going on over here? So we're going to see what's going on in just a moment, but it sounds like what's happening is like this. Let's just seize upon the first case. Let's say again, Reuven lost his father, and so Reuven decided that on the day that his father passed away, he's going to go ahead and not eat meat and drink wine. By the way, I will point out to you something very interesting. The Rishonim point out there is a minhag. There is a minhag to fast on a yard site, specifically for a child to fast on the yard site of his parent. It's a minhag, not a halacha. Where does that minhag come from? Many point to this Gemara. This idea that on the yard site itself, a person observes certain mourning practices. So listen to this. So the Gemara says, so therefore I take upon myself, right? I take upon myself to go ahead and say, I will not eat meat and drink wine like the day that my father passed away, or like the day that Gedalia ben Achikam was assassinated, like the day that I saw Yerushalayim in a state of ruin. Now let's qualify this case. V'amar Shmuel says, we're talking about a case where he made a neder on that day. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at the Ran. Take a look at Rabbi in the intermediate wide lines of the Ran, second line in. Writes the Ran, V'chein nadar pam achas shel yochal basar biyom shemeis bo gedav menachigim va'achshav matfis yom acher ke'osa yom. So Shmuel says, what's the case? It must be. The case is where, right, Reuven's father passed away. So let's say Reuven's father passed away on the 12th of Cheshvan. So Reuven said, for now on the 12th of Cheshvan, I'm not going to eat meat and drink wine. Okay. So we'll say now another day comes along, and Reuven says, today, let's say now both say it's the 12th of Kislev, for whatever, doesn't matter what date, right? Another day, not the yard site. Reuven says, today should be like the day my father passed away. So we'll say, so what is that? Now that's a case of hatfasa. What are you doing? You're taking today, which is or we'll call it the 12th of Kislev, which is a permitted day. And what are you doing? You're attaching it to the yard site day. The yard site day now is bound by what? A neder, not to eat meat and not to drink wine. Okay, so this seems to be a good classic case of hatfasa, to which the Gemara says, good. Now, what's the case? Lav kigon dekoy bechad b'shava demis be'avua va'af agav de'ika tuva chad b'shava de'etera v'katani aser shmamina be'ikar hu matvis. So I will say it must be that what's happening over here. It must be dekoy bechad b'shabes demis be'avua. Now look at the Ran for just a moment again. The Ran says Nira be'inai dahachi pirusha she'omer biyom echa b'shabes shehu biyom shemis po'aviv leminyan chadashim. So what's interesting to hear is like this. The Gemara posits that maybe the way we look at this is like this. When Reuven loses his father, and now it's the 12th of Cheshvan, so he decides that, you know what, today I'm not going to eat meat and drink wine. Then what happens? The yard site comes, and Reuven says, this day should be like the day my father died. So it's the same day. It's the same 12th of Cheshvan. So ultimately, now here's what's interesting. So now it's a year later, 12th of Cheshvan. So Rabbi say, even though now, let's say, and it's a Sunday, right? Sunday, 12th of Cheshvan. So now, even though, it doesn't have to be the same date, it's a Sunday, right? So even though now there's been many days in between the day that his father died and today, so Rabbi say, so what's happening over here? So imagine for just a moment, it's Sunday. And he says this Sunday should be like this, should be like that Sunday, right? Let me go back to Gemara for just a moment. So we'll say, so now what happened? Let's say, just to keep this easy, let's say Reuven's father died on 12th of Cheshvan, that's a Sunday, right? So now what happens now, a year or whatever number of years later, it's the same date, right? It's Sunday, the 12th of Cheshvan. And what does Reuven say? Reuven says, today, this day, should be like the day my father passed away. Now I will say, there's been a year of Sundays in between the death of Reuven's father and today. So when he says this day should be like the day my father passed away, this so we'll say there's a whole bunch of Sundays. All of those Sundays in between were all permitted. But now that he says this day should be like the Sunday my father passed away, what do we say? What is he doing? He's being matfis, right? He's connecting today with the original date of death. So therefore the Gemara is suggesting what? Even though there have been many Sundays that have been permitted, v'katani aser. Yet, when he goes ahead and he says that the day should be like the day that my father died, what is he doing? He's attaching himself to the original Sunday his father passed away, and halacha l'maisa asering himself in meat and wine. What do you see from here? The Gemara says, Shmamina be'ikar hu matvis. Now, you see from here that halacha l'maisa, when you are connecting a permitted item with a prohibited item, and that prohibited item, we'll call it, has two states. One is permitted, one is prohibited. Katfasa says we connect it to the original prohibited state. So when Reuven says that today should be like that Sunday my father passed away, even though again, or should be like that Sunday, even though again there's been a whole bunch of permitted Sundays, we view him as linking himself to that original Sunday his father passed away, and thereby prohibiting this current day in meat and wine. Similarly, going back to Rabbi Chama's case, when a person has a meat of shlomim after zrika on the table, and there's another piece of meat that's there, and he says, zeh kazeh, even though the shlomim meat is currently permitted, we view him as linking the permitted piece of meat to what? To the original state of shlomim prior to zrika, and not to the current state. Incredible. So the Shmuel Hechiyitmar. So by the way, we're not finished with Shmuel's case. When was Shmuel's case stated? So the Gemara says, Amar Shmuel, v'hu shenadar uba me'os hayom ve'elech. What's the case, Rabbi Osai? The case ultimately, again, is where a person went ahead and look at Rashi for just a moment. Me'os hayom, Rashi says, kigon de ba'os yom shemis aviv kibal alav beneder shelo yehe ochel basar. Ukigon the hava osa yom chad be'ir deika chad b'shabes de'atera tuva ben sayim. So again, Shmuel's case was actually said, or a person was taking a self-perpetuating neder. It's not just that he went ahead and he took this neder one time and that was it. Rather, again, he took this neder and he said this neder will be in effect going forward. Okay, so we'll say that's the Ran. I'm sorry, I read the Ran a little bit too early. If you go back to the Ran, the Shmuel Hachi Itmar Amar Shmuel v'hush nadr ubam me'osem ve'elech kilomar shekol yomei echad b'shabbos she'avra alav shein kiyom shemeis ba'aviv nesra alav b'neder v'cheivan shekein lo matzis lemigmar mehacha haydina v'lomar dahach rabusa shmoinan dahacha leka yomei de'atera klal. So we'll say the Ran's understanding of this is actually quite interesting. The Ran says that halacha l'maisa, the neder is actually that every Sunday should be like this. Every Sunday should be like this. So here, this is a self-perpetuating neder. So this really is not a raya to our case. You see, Rabbi say, because in this case, again, he's prohibiting every Sunday from the death of his father. So this is not a good raya, this case. Interesting case, and like I said, I mentioned before, serves as a makar, as a source for the concept of fasting or abstaining from something on a yard site, but really nothing to do with Rami Bar Chama's case. Good, let's go weiter. So the Gemara says, Amar Ravina, Tashma, listen to this. Kechalas Aron ukitrumasel mutter. So let's listen to this. Let's say a person goes ahead and what? Has a loaf of bread, right? And I say this loaf of bread should be like the challah of Aaron. What's talach? Or like the truma of Aaron. Ultimately, again, no state of prohibition devolves upon the loaf. The loaf is mutter. Now look at the Ran for just a moment, second to last line. Kichalas Aaron k'shumas mutter. Dafagav the b'kriya shem misri. Kevan sheino asr lakol. Right? Davar ha-asr mikri. V'lo davar hanadar. So both is interesting. The reason the Ran seems to say is because challah and truma are considered to be inherently asr. So remember again, as I mentioned before, we haven't seen the source for this, but the concept of hatfasa, linking something permitted to something prohibited, only applies if the prohibited item is prohibited because of a neder. But if the prohibited item is inherently asr, hatfasa does not work. The Gemara posits that challah and truma are inherently asr, therefore hatfasa won't work. Haki truma slach metoda asr. Yet interesting, Rabbi say, if you were to go ahead and link the permitted loaf to, let's say again, the truma of lachmei toda. Rabbi say, what's the truma of lachmei toda? Look at the Ran again, last line. Chala acha shayanota mikol eser chalos shal komin shbar. Rabbi say, we're going to see, by the way, that halacha l'maisa, carbon toda came with 40 loaves. 40 loaves. Now, why 40? The loaves were prepared in 4 different ways. 4 different ways. So you had 10 loaves of each type. You would then take 1 loaf of each batch and give that to the Kohen. That would be the truma that you would go ahead. It technically sounds like Maisa, but it's the truma you would go ahead and give to the Kohen from the lachmei toda. So I will say, so this is actually quite interesting. So the Gemara says like this: if you go ahead and you say this loaf of bread should be like chalas aron or like truma, ultimately the neder doesn't take effect throughout tfasa because you're attaching the permitted item to something that is inherently asr. Conversely, if you say that this loaf of bread should be like the truma of lachmei toda, I will say because a toda is a davar hanador, right? A toda ultimately again comes about as a result of a neder. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, that hatfasa. Remember again, because that's what I said before. When do you bring a carbon toda? When do you bring a carbon toda? When you were delivered from some life-threatening situation. Now, obviously, it's obligatory to bring a carbon toda in those situations, but even though it's obligatory, your designation of a particular animal as carbon, by definition, puts it in the category of a neder. Since it's in other words, the animal is only consecrated when I do it, therefore it takes on the status, ultimately, again, of a neder. Now, the truth be told also, you could also go ahead and bring a toda of your own volition, right, on your own. You could pledge, you could voluntarily give a toda as well. So the idea is, if you link your carbon to the loaves given to Aaron from the lachmei toda, that works, right? Lachmei toda aser. And the Ran says last time before you turn the page, the havele matfis bedavar hanadar. Because I remember again, a toda is considered to be a neder. So therefore, when you link the permitted loaf, ultimately again to the loaves of the toda, that works. Amid base. So the Gemara says, 1 second. But the chumas lachmei toda, right? The loaves, ultimately again, really are only given after Zrika. Look at the Ran for just a moment. But Trumas lachmei toda la'achar Zrika is damimhi. Decheven de lachmei toda lo sharo ba'achila ad la'achar Zrika lame yisrumu osan. What I was about to say, the only time you would ever give truma from the loaves is when the loaves can be eaten. And the only time the loaves can be eaten is when? After Zrika. So we'll say, what does this sound like over here? This sounds like over here that when you go ahead and you do hatfasa to a prohibited item, it sounds like you're linking it when? To the post-Zrika state. To which the Gemara says, Ema kitrumas halishka aser. No. Perhaps what it meant to say was like this. If you go ahead and you take a loaf of bread and you say this loaf should be kitrumas halishka, they will say, what's trumas halishka? That's the machzis hashekel. Machzis hashekel, then ultimately again it's aser. Now both say, once again, machzis hashekel is a davar hanadar, right? A person gives it, and by giving it, ultimately again, he's consecrating it. So if you link your loaf of bread to trumas halishka, that's a valid neder through hatfasa. Now I could infer from that about truma lachmei toda mai. I will say if you were to link your loaf of bread to the loaves of to the loaves of toda, or to the truma from the loaves of toda that you give to the kohen, what would be the halacha? Mutter. It sounds like over here that it would be mutter. Why Abosai? Because again, if we're talking about after Zrika is permitted for consumption. To which the Gemara said, if that's the case, listne lachmei toda the kol shekin trumaso. So we'll say if that's the case, then just go ahead and don't get into truma, and instead just say, if you go ahead and you take a loaf of bread and you say this loaf of bread should be like lachmei toda, ultimately again it's going to be mutter, and all the more so if you link it to the truma given from the lachmei toda, it's also going to be mutter. To which the Gemara says, hakamash malon trumas lachmei toda trumasohi. So we'll say, interestingly enough, it's coming to teach us that what? That the truma of the lachmei toda mamish has the status ultimately again of actual truma. So he wants to vibai. Another possibility is trumas lachmei toda nami kodem zrikas daminu. Well, see, here's a fascinating possibility. Maybe not. Maybe the case of trumas lachmei toda is actually taking place before zrika. Now I will say before zrika. How would it be happening before zrika? Kigon da'afar shinhu belisha. So we'll say this is fascinating. What's the case? The case is where you're separating out Aaron's portion, right, the truma from the lachmei toda, while the loaves are still being kneaded. Now both say, now the beauty of that is, if it's before zrika, then we still look at this as a davar hanador, right, as a davar hanador. To which the Gemara says, one second, how you now? We'll say, now we're going to get a little bit technical into toda. V'chi hadam Rav Tuvi bar Kisna Amar Shmuel. Lachmei toda sha'afan ba'arba chalos yatsa. So we'll say, remember again, this is fascinating. How many loaves normally accompany a carbon toda? How many? 40. Now remember again, the way it works is the loaves are prepared in 4 different ways, 10 loaves of each type. Well, let's say you decided, can you imagine, let's say you decided, instead of 10 loaves, I want to make instead of 40 loaves, I'm just going to make 4 big loaves. One loaf of each type, and essentially I'll combine 10 smaller loaves into one big, like a Rebbe Shachala, like one of those, I'm going to go ahead and make 4 big loaves. So the Gemara says, listen to this. So the Gemara says, because after all, the Amar Rabbi Tuva bar Kisna Amar Shmuel, Lachmei toda sha'afan ba'arba chalos yatsa. So ultimately, again, if you went ahead and technically speaking, I'll say it works. In other words, if you were to take 10 smaller loaves and combine them into one big loaf, so instead of 40 loaves, you have 4 big loaves, right? Each loaf really representing 10 smaller loaves from each different type. It works. One second, v'haksiv arboim, but the pasuk says you have to bring 40 loaves. To which the Gemara says, you're right, lemitzvah. That's only there to tell you lechatchila. Lechatchila, you should have 40 loaves. But halacha l'maisa, even if you don't have 40 loaves, ultimately, again, it works. To which the Gemara says, "V'habayla mishkal truma." But one second, if you only have 4 loaves, 4 large loaves, then at the end of the day, how are you taking a portion for the kohanim from that? To which the Gemara says, "V'chitem b'deshakal chadarifta al kula." Well, I have a good idea. Maybe just take 1 big mama loaf, right? Just take 1 big zaftig loaf. Because I will say 1 big loaf represents what? 10 loaves. So just take one and give that to the Kohen. Doesn't work. I'll tell you, Vatnan, Echad mikol carbon, shaliyita mi carbon al chavero. They both say in general, there's a concept by carbonos that whenever the kohanim are entitled to a portion, you can't double up on one carbon and use that to exempt another carbon. So same thing with lachmei toda. The kohen is entitled ultimately again to one loaf from each type of loaves. So therefore, giving him one big loaf, even though again that one big loaf is comprised of 10 smaller loaves, does not satisfy the criteria. Okay. So I have an idea. Maybe we'll go ahead and we'll just take, so I will say, so now in this case over here, I have 4 big loaves for the Toda. Maybe I'll just take one little piece of each loaf, give that to the kohen to satisfy his obligation. Vatanan, that doesn't work. Vatanan, echad, shelo yital prusa. The Torah says you have to give the kohen echad. Echad. So I will say echad means what? A whole and not a piece. Ella da'afreshinu belisha. See, Rabbi said the only way this works is how? Is if you say that while kneading the dough to make the loaves, you separate out the kohen's portion while you're kneading the dough. So that you could do. So go ahead and separate a portion from each batch. In other words, remember again, I will say in this case, you're only making 4 big loaves. So you have 4 batches then of 4 different types of loaves. Take out a kohanic portion from each kneading bowl, and that should work. To which the Gemara says, El dafreshinu belisha, the shakel chad mechametz, the shakel chad mechametz, the chada min chalos, the chada min rikikim, the chada min revucha. So we'll say, so this ultimately, again, these are the 4 types. You'll take one from the chametz kneading bowl, which is the one that becomes leaven, right? One from the chala kneading bowl, which ultimately, again, is the one that doesn't become chametz. The chada min rikikim means wafers, the chada min revucha, scalded loaves. So we'll say these are just the 4 different ways that the loaves were prepared. So if Rabbi says, there is a way, just wait. By the way, a couple of interesting facts. Number 1, carbon toden requires 40 loaves. Number 2, you're obligated to give the kohen one of each loaf from each type, right? Number 3, technically speaking, if you didn't want to make 10 smaller loaves, but instead you just wanted to, or I should say 40 small loaves, but you just wanted to make one big loaf for each batch, each of the 4 types of bread, that would work. The problem is, the only way to satisfy your kohanic obligation in that case is how? By separating out for the kohen when? While the dough itself is still being kneaded. Incredible. So by the way, very interesting. There's only one problem. We still have not solved our question. Remember again, we started today's daf. Rami Bar Chama is asking a very simple question. I have a piece of shlama meat after zrika on the table. I have a piece of ordinary meat. I say, zeh kazeh. So we'll say, what's my shaila? What's the status of the meat? What does it depend on? Am I linking the meat to the pre-zrika status of the shlamim, what we call ikaro? Or ultimately, again, am I linking the regular meat to the present status of the shlamim meat, which we call kehetera? That's the fundamental shaila. We still haven't answered it. Which the Gemara says, you're right. Maybe lema ketanoi. Maybe this whole thing is a machlokes tanam. Here we go. Harei alai kibechar. It's an interesting case. Let's say I go ahead and I take, and I will say, it doesn't really matter what the object is. You can just keep it simple, like a loaf of bread. I take a loaf of bread. I say this loaf of bread should be like a bechar animal. Rabbi Yaakov Oser, Rabbi Huda Matir. So now remember again, bechar means the firstborn of your animals you give to the kohen. So now I say this loaf of bread should be like a bechar. Rabbi Yaakov says the loaf becomes aser. Rabbi Huda says it's mutter. So what's the case? Hechi dami. Inema lifnei zrikas damim. If we're talking about the bechar right before the blood has been sprinkled, my time of demand is shari. Then I both say everyone should agree that it's aser because a bechar before zrika is aser. So what's that? Why would you go ahead and permit it? To which the Gemara says, right? So the Ran says, last round on the page, he says, ha bechar. By the way, I don't know why I use the loaf. In other words, it's easier to say basar, right? Basar, right? This meat should be like the meat of a bechar. That's what we're saying. This meat should be like the meat of a bechar. That's the Ran's case. If you look at the Ran right before last line, hechi dami ilema tamahare alai basar zek kibasa bechar. So we'll say, if at the end of the day I'm saying this meat should be like the meat of a bechar, if it's before zrika, then of course it's aser. Because bechar before zrika is going to be aser. So the Gemara says, "V'ila achaz zrikas damim," and if at the end of the day, it's after zrika, then my time and demand the aser. Then why would anyone say it's aser? Because bechar meat after zrika is going to be permitted. Elalav, I will say top of Yud Gimel, top of Yud Gimel, right? Top of Yud Gimel. Ella lav demachis basar bechar umasar basar dehech gabe va'amar ze kazeh v'tanahi. Oh, now we'll say, what's the case? This is Rabbi Bar Chama's case. It's Rabbi Bar Chama's case. What do I have? I have a piece of meat on the table, a regular piece of meat, and ultimately, again, I have a piece of bachar meat. And what Rabbi say? I go ahead and I say zeh kazeh. Rabbi say the case must be that it's the bachar meat after zrika, right? And I say zeh kazeh. And so we'll say, so what's the shaila? What's the meaning of zeh kazeh? Does zeh kazeh mean that I'm linking the bachar meat? I'm sorry, the permitted meat to the bachar meat pre-zrika or post-zrika? That's the shaila. And I will say, what do you see from here? It's a machlokes tanaim. So I will say, now, by the way, so there's good news and bad news, right? The good news is we've now shown. What's going on over here? There's something I said, right? Right. So I'll say, so ultimately, the Gemara says like this: halacha l'maisa. So again, the good news is we've now shown that Rami Bar Chama's shaila is a machlokes tanaim. Now, what haven't we done? We haven't answered it. But again, I will say, but at least what we're showing is this is a fundamental machlokes. When you take a permitted item and you link it to an item which has two states, an initial inherent prohibited state and a current permitted state, which state are you linking the permitted item to? The ikr, the original primary prohibited state, or the current permitted state? Machlokes, and I will say we're not finished. To which the Gemara says, lo. No. Here we go. Everyone agrees that when you link a permitted item to a carbonic item, you are linking the permitted item to the initial inherent prohibited state of the carbon. Everyone agrees with that. My time of demand is shari. So we'll say if that's the case, then ultimately again, then why does one opinion permit? In this case, I will say in the Bachar case, then why does one opinion permit halacha l'maisa? When I go ahead and I link the basar to Bachar after Zrika, so why does one opinion permit it? To which the Gemara says, Amakra, here we go. Ki yidar ad sheyidar bedavar hanidar. La fuke Bachar de davar ha'aserhu. So we'll say, here's the distinction. Let's see, this goes back for just a moment. Remember, this is what we said before, and here's the drasha. Ad sheyidar, we'll say, hatfasa, linking a permitted item to a prohibited item only works when the prohibited item itself is prohibited through a neder. But ultimately, again, if the prohibited item is inherently usher, then hatfasa does not work. The Gemara is suggesting Bachar is an example of something which is inherently prohibited. That's why Rabbi say, that is why Rabbi Yehuda says, if you link a piece of meat to a Bachar, it doesn't matter before Zrika, after Zrika, Hatfasa doesn't work. Why doesn't Hatfasa work? Because Hatfasa only works with a Davar Hanidor, with something itself which is prohibited by a Neder, but Bachar is inherently Asar. Uman da Asar, so I will say, again, according to the opinion that says, ultimately, again, Man da Asar Amakra, La Hashem, L'Rabos Davar HaAsar. So we'll say the other opinion, i.e., Rabbi Yaakov, right? Rabbi Yaakov will say, no, Hatfasa even works with the Davar HaAsar. So we'll say, so now it turns out, by the way, that what is this? This is a fundamental machlokes in Hatfasa. In Hatfasa, the concept of linkage, of neder linkage. So we'll say, so again, does Hatfasa only work? So one opinion holds, Hatfasa only works when you link the permitted item to a prohibited item, but the prohibited item itself has to only be asr because of a neder, right? And therefore, again, Bachar won't work because Bachar is inherently asr. Second opinion holds no. Hatfasa even works when an item is inherently prohibited. So the Gemara says, Uman deshari la Hashem avidle. So we'll say the one who says that it's permitted because Hatfasa only works ultimately again with a davar hanadar, not a davar ha'asr. What does he do with la Hashem? Mibayle lematvis bechatas va'asham. It teaches us, I will say, an interesting idea. That here's the distinction. That Allah l'maisa, I should probably stop. All right, you know what? We'll stop over here for today. I'm going to leave you a little bit in the middle. But I do want to close out. So now, I will say, it turns out that halacha l'maisa, there's actually more fundamental machlokes, right? The more fundamental machlokes is in the mechanics of hatfasa, right? The mechanics of hatfasa. How does hatfasa work? Does hatfasa only work to a davar hanidor, to something itself that is prohibited through a neder, but something that is inherently usher, it does not work or not? That's a machlokes. Rabbi say, but let's go back for just a moment. What about Rami Bar Chama's original question? Rami Bar Chama's original question, which is that Rabbi say, I'm linking a piece of meat. Now, ultimately, a permitted piece of meat to shlamim after zrika. So what's the halacha? Is that a neder or not a neder? Right? Or does it prohibit or not? What is that based on? Which state of shlamim am I linking the permitted meat to? To the ikar, original prohibited state, or to the present permitted state? So we'll say, so listen to this. Hilchos Nedarim, halacha tes vav. Listen to this. Haya lefana basar kodesh, afilu haya basar shalma achas jikas tam mishumut lazarim, va'amar harei alai kebasar, harei ze'elu asurin, shelo hitfis ela bi'ikaro. The Rama Paskins halacha l'maisra will say that when you go ahead and you do hatfasa, so let's go back to Rabbi Chama's case. I have a permitted piece of meat on the table. There's shlomim after zrika on the table as well. And I say, Harei zeh kizeh. How do we paskin? We paskin as a valid neder through hatfasa. Why? Because the way hatfasa works is you're linking the permitted item with the prohibited item, bi'ikaro, in its original prohibited state. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, the neder work abosai. We'll stop over here. Tremendous yeshikach abosai. Shkoyach. Smichas chaver, those of you who are smichas chaver, Emir Hashem. Emir Hashem, 10 o'clock. We'll say, I am Emir Hashem leaving for Eretz Yisrael. So tonight, Rabbi Richter is going to be giving shir tomorrow. I hope Emir Hashem to be able to give live virtually at some point over the. Rabbi Richter is on. He's ready. He's ready to go. Right? He's right. So we'll say, so Emir Hashem, but I'll keep you apprised of the schedule on the WhatsApp group. Shkach Abosai. Morning, Greg. Shkoyach.